All right, kids, here we go with the first of a series of video lectures. The idea here is that, you know what, I can go through some of this material. You probably read some of it as well, and then you can kind of see another version of it, listen to the ideas, and then we can talk about it in class. You come in with questions, etc. The assignment is to go through this, take some notes. I'm not saying you get every last thing down, but the major things that stand out. So I don't know, a couple of pages of notes. You can do it by hand and take photographs, or you can do it electronically. Doesn't really matter. And also identify some questions that you have. They can be, wait a minute, I really didn't understand this idea. Can you clarify? Or it could be, when you talk about India during this period, I know a little bit about India today. Do you think there's a connection with? Again, so it can be sort of like open-ended and creative or just factual stuff that you didn't get. We're going to go through this fairly quickly. The new Advanced Placement World History course starts really at the year 1200. And you'll notice the dates 500 BCE to 600 CE. That is well before the year 1200. Let me stop actually for a second and say, wait a minute. BCE, CE. What do those letters mean? By the way, periodically, I will ask you to stop the video and answer a question to yourself. You don't need to write it down. I can't enforce this. The school is not allowing me to put cameras in your rooms to watch if you're actually stopping things. But the more that you engage with this stuff, with the reading, with the lectures, with the other readings that you're doing, the more it makes sense to you when you question yourself about what you're learning. Hey, that's the best studying, that's the best learning you can do. So stop the video for a second and see if you can tell me what BCE and CE means. Yeah, I'm assuming you just stopped your lecture. Normally, we talk BC and AD. This is the year 2020 AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. This is according to the Western Christian-based calendar in which Jesus was thought to have been born about 2020 years ago. We actually know that the historical Jesus was probably born a few years before that, to the best of our ability to understand this. But it was just a common idea. The world started anew when Jesus Christ was born. Now, of course, that's not true for 75% of the world's population. Those who are not Christians, those who might look at Jesus and say, sounds like a good guy. I don't think he's the Son of God, but I'm glad you believe in him. Well, it doesn't make as much sense for the rest of the world. There's a definite bias here by saying the world starts anew at 2020. Therefore, what we have is BCE and CE, before the Common Era. The Common Era. In other words, it's acknowledged that if you go to any part of the world and say, I'll be there in 2021, everybody knows what you're talking about. However, many different societies had their own calendars. The Mayans have had their own calendars. Ethiopia's calendar is either 8 years ahead or behind. I don't recall which. In the Muslim world, we are talking something like in the 1480s right now. I couldn't tell you the exact date. And if you ever go to a Muslim country and you see a newspaper, they will generally give you the Muslim date, 1481, etc., and the Common Era date, so we're all speaking the same language. We are not going to go into tremendous detail about most of these empires. Again, it's not strictly on the exam, but there are some things that would be extremely helpful to know about, both where they are region-wise and how they affect the world afterwards. The main ones you see before you right now. FRQ, free response question. You will be seeing lots of free response questions in this class and on the AP exam. Later, we'll talk about how they are specifically set up. One of them gives you documents to work with, one does not, but FRQ is the free response question. And I'm going to try to teach you this year some shortcuts. One of the problems that students have with this course is, oh my God, I'm supposed to memorize every single thing that happened over an 800-year period. Of course, it used to be worse because it used to be a tens of thousands of year period. And of course, nobody can do this. you will start seeing questions in which they ask you about trade routes in the Indian Ocean basin in the 14th century versus overland trade routes in Central Europe in the 17th century. You say, my God, I don't know this. I don't have facts memorized. However, what you learn to do is to think historically about the types of things that might apply. And once these things come to mind, once you get skilled at this, you can say, well, can I think of an example of this general tendency in history that might apply to China? Oh, got it. For example, a question that they used to like to ask. Now, granted, we don't see it quite as much because it's more modern times now, but you still will see this. A question along the lines of why compare and contrast how these two civilizations collapsed. Now, in the olden days, you might get the Han Empire in China and the Roman Empire and say, oh my God, we spent 20 minutes on that in class 6 months ago. I have no flippin' idea. I'll take a zero on it. You don't need to do that. What you can say is, I have studied how empires fell apart. I know that there are some general things that happen that cause giant empires to weaken, and then I can apply it to these two countries, perhaps areas, picking up perhaps an example or two. Stop the film for a second and tell me when a civilization or an empire falls apart. Off the top of your head, can you identify one, two, or three general reasons why that might happen? All right, let me give you general answers. I will tell you that first of all, when in doubt, they overextend. It becomes really difficult to administer a large tract of land, the distance in order to administer, to send government officials out, to keep people happy. Also, if you're taking in many groups of people that don't speak the same language or share the same cultural values or religion, environmental depletion, welcome to 2020. Right now, all of Earth's civilization may be on the verge of destroying itself through environmental reasons. And this happened repeatedly from the Mayans to the Romans to you name it. Absolutely. Well, outside invaders, sure. History is filled with this. Strong, powerful empire, warring army came in, destroyed them. This applies to most of them. Misgovernment, bad leaders, selfish decisions, leaders get corrupt. Do we see this in the world today? Do we see this in virtually every civilization? Sure. Economic problems, poverty, hunger, peasants revolting, government goes into debt, it taxes too high. You know what? My guess is that all of these, disease, absolutely, that destroys the population. Here we are in a pandemic year in 2020. We can see the fear of that. The idea this could lead to social upheaval. It is leading to social upheaval. Again, any or all of these things may apply to a specific civilization at a specific time. Your job would be to have a general idea when you get the question about why wars begin, about why there are economic changes in a society. Well, it generally has to do with some of these four or five things. We call this a mental backpack. You just know, you think along these lines, and then you think about the specific civilization that you've learned some about. Can I apply one or two of these to that civilization? It's less difficult than it seems. Oh, and there's my answer, all or most of the above. China. First of all, when we think of China, we think of that giant green thing that you see in the middle. And of course, there's nothing magical about those borders. They have expanded through war, through treaty, through all kinds of things. They have declined. You will notice that these early dynasties, and you do not need to know their names by any means, but the Zhou Dynasty, which is one of the earliest, greatest ones, lasted about 800 years. You'll see that's just that little area in white. Couple of terms worth looking at. The mandate of heaven, absolutely. The Great Wall begins in a way during this. We'll come back to it. The names Confucius, to a lesser degree Lao Tzu. To understand China in the modern day, you've got to know this for sure. One interesting point that I make with China is that you will notice that there is what they call a period of warring states, where the Zhou dynasty is starting to collapse. you'll notice that there is about a 500-year period of weakened government, of warfare. And one of the messages I think this sends to you is that China's history is long, long, long. You think about Bolivian history, you think about American history, you say, wow, that was a 30-year period. Oh my goodness, that was 60 years ago. To the Chinese, that's nothing historically. Oh, China was a great power for many thousands of years. Oh, and then we had a 500 or so year period where we were weaker, but we recovered from that. 500 or so years is longer than the existence of the United States and Bolivia put together. For China, it's just a brief in between period. China is unified as an official Chinese empire going back to what we call the Qin Empire with Shi Huangdi. Qin Shi Huangdi was the first emperor, pulled it together, started building the Great Wall. It's not the Great Wall of China that you see today with these massive stone. It's mainly mud and earth and so forth. Notice that the wall was not to keep people in, it's to keep outsiders out. Legalism is a term that you're going to see, we're not going to use in this class, but you're going to see it repeated throughout world history. And the bottom line is the belief that the ruler needs to be all powerful because he deserves to be, because the heavens support him, and it keeps order. No more about Shi Huangdi and the Qins at this point. Again, this is very brief because it's not a part of the formal course. Today, oops, I'm not entirely sure why that happened. I hope that didn't screw everything up. The first great sort of universal empire, notice the size of the Han Empire, lasts about 400 years, population of about 60 million people. You know what? As always, that's close to a fifth to a quarter of the world population. There are a lot of Chinese people out there. Hey, if you've ever heard the phrase, you are one in a million, you might feel all proud of yourself, but what that means is that there are 1,400 Chinese people who are identical to you in every way. That's China's population today, 1 million times 1,400. The Silk Roads we will talk about later. It's not actually the Silk Road, there are many of them, but they're overland transport. Trade is huge in this class. It's not simply the stuff that gets traded, but the ideas as well. And notice Buddhism, which we'll talk about later, that began in India, comes back to China and becomes a very powerful force because of trade. The civil service examination, we'll get back to it, but China is unique in early histories in that it wasn't simply if your parents were wealthy and powerful, you inherited their position. To a degree, you had to learn it. You had to learn and you had to earn that. It was what we call a meritocracy. Krasi means power. Merit means goodness. Your position in society, to a degree, was determined upon your ability. You would take these long Confucius based exams, and if you did well on them, you did exceptionally well, you could rise to almost the highest level of power. That was not true in later Europe and many other parts of the world, where, well, if your father was a noble, a lord, you were all powerful, end of story. Part of China's genius is embracing that. Confucius, who we'll talk about in a moment, he was not wealthy, came from a very humble family, became almost without question the most powerful and influential person in Chinese history. Stop and tell me if you've seen this before. Tell yourself, because I'm not listening. Swear to God, I'm not listening. Tell me what this is, what it represents. This is, of course, the yin and yang symbol, the darkness, the light, the opposites. Western thought is sort of on a line of, hey, is this good or is it bad? And let's move forward toward more good. This is not an Eastern conception. The idea is, oh, there is light out there, but we can't understand light unless we have dark. We can't understand good unless we have evil. We can't have female unless there is an idea of male. And you'll notice in this ingenious little symbol, you will see, for example, the dark. I forget if that's the yin or the yang. I can never keep it straight. But notice in the middle you see this little dot of its opposite. And the argument is that in everything on this earth, both human and otherwise, and in the cosmos, yes, there are things that have their tendencies, but within that tendency, within that characteristic, is the seed of the opposite. An example I might think if I had taken martial arts lessons and I was the greatest fighter in the entire country and nobody can beat me, well, that's strength, that's power, that's dominance, but there is the seed of my weakness in that. An example might be that I become so overconfident that I pick a fight that I can't win and it leads to my destruction. Well, on the surface was the power and the strength, and underneath it was the weakness that would destroy it. And in the Chinese worldview, you see the yin and the yang. Really going back 2,500 years, you can argue that starting in the 20th century, China abandoned this, but a lot of the ideology is here. No society lives in one way for 2,500 years. There's a revolution in 1949 and it all stops. That's not how it works. You will notice the two major forces, the yin and the yang of Confucianism and Taoism. We'll get into these in a moment. Confucianism is out there, public, relations between people, education, responsibility toward others. And then its opposite of Taoism, private, nature based, allowing nature to take its course, mystical, mysterious. Well, the question is, which is China? Is it public interaction Confucianist? Is it private, separate, nature based Taoism? And the answer is it's both. It's the yin and yang of these endless cycles between the two of them. I will skip these, but you can stop for a moment if you want to read a little bit about Confucius, Confuci. Of course, we are talking a Chinese script, which is not going to be directly translatable into English, so you'll hear it pronounced different ways. But feel free to read these over to get a sense of what Confucius was about. Lao Tzu, again, this is Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. Looking at this, maybe even go back in the video and compare the two a little bit. I mean, the first one, Confucius is so clear, this is what you must do, this is your responsibility. But my goodness, you take a look at what Lao Tzu is writing. The Tao that can be known is not Tao. The substance of the world is only a name for Tao. Tao is all that exists and may exist. Well, it almost seems like nonsense, except what I think it's getting at is that with Taoism, because we're talking about the spirit world, the unknowable, the darkness, nature, we can't put this into words. You can feel it, you can accept it. Again, what was China? Was it a logical, reason, thought, interactive based society of Confucianism? Yes, it was. Was it also a private, spiritual, mystical, unknowable, except that you know it by feeling it society? Like in Taoism? Yes, it was. It was both. And that's not a contradiction according to the Chinese worldview. Legalism, again, I won't spend time with this, but the idea, and this has also been a trait within China, the ruler knows best, follow the ruler, end of story. You don't trust individuals, all powerful ruler. Of course, China has always had a largely all powerful emperor. And in fact, even today in the communist state, absolutely, there is a definite top down approach in China. So elements of legalism as well. Little bit to know about Confucianism. One of the questions you will get a lot is about social structure in societies. How do societies organize themselves? How do they organize labor, for example? Is it a matter of a free market in which if you want to do a job for a certain amount of pay, you get hired and you try to find something better if you want it? Is it government provided labor that equalizes? Is it slave labor? Is it forced labor? Are women allowed to work in or outside of the home? All of these things have to do with social hierarchy. Confucianism is one of the earliest. And you know what? The fascinating thing about China, it didn't change for a long time. People have made the argument that if you had gone into suspended animation in China 2,000 years ago and suddenly appeared in the year 1850, you'd see some changes, but you wouldn't see a lot. Confucius ideas, they were at the heart of it. The language, the written language, was essentially the same. Now, for anybody who's ever tried to read Shakespeare and say, oh my God, what are these people saying? What's all this theeth and thoueth stuff? I don't get it. You know what? Chinese written language has barely changed. Chinese students of mine said, oh, I can read something from 2,000 years ago and it makes sense to me. That's a tremendous amount of stability. And a large part of this is the Confucian emphasis on a social system. Interestingly, in Confucianism, it is not a matter of the super wealthy with all the power. In fact, the highest level was the scholar, the knowledgeable person, the person who knew the Confucian classics. Interestingly, if you were to say today, oh, there's a school district in California that's 95% Asian, 95% Chinese, or children of immigrants, you would say, oh, I'll bet it's a really good school. Now, that's a stereotype, but it's based in fact as well, because there is within Chinese culture, much like I'd say with Jewish culture as well, a reverence for education, for scholarship. Who you are is what you've learned and what you can do, as opposed to the circumstances of your birth and what your parents and grandparents did. Notice at the very bottom of the hierarchy, you've got the merchants, you've got the money handlers. They were looked down upon as being kind of a despised, gross, uncultured. It's only about money. That's not what a real person should do. There is always a conflict, though, because the reality is the merchants, the money people, they have a lot of power. So, although they may be scorned and looked down upon in theory, many of the emperors over the years depended upon them as well. Hey, how do we create the society that we want? A hierarchical, harmonious society. Education. The classics of Confucius and others, they were to be memorized word for word, and these massive exam systems that people would study for, not like a few months with an AP exam. They would spend 10, 15, 20 years round the clock, 100 hours a week, studying, learning, memorizing, being ready to apply. That was the basis of the society. Notice that although there is a definite hierarchy, the father is above the child, the man very much so above the woman, the teacher above the student, the scholar above the peasant or the merchant. To be true, that's absolutely true. But it was a sense of obligations. If I am the ruler, the emperor, look, I'm above you. We're not co equals in a society. But it's not as if I go and do whatever I want to do. I have obligations as the teacher, as the father, as the emperor, to treat you in a way to help you prosper. My job is not to be cuddly as your teacher, to make you feel good, to give you A's for doing nothing. Maybe it's my job to criticize you, to yell at you, in the old days, perhaps to beat you. I'm not allowed to do it at this school. I don't know why. Um, but the idea was that it's my responsibility not just to randomly mistreat you. That would be a terrible abuse of my power and would create social disharmony, but to be firm, to be strict, and to keep you in line so that you can become the better person. Ancestor worship, Confucianism, is not really a religion. It's more like a social system or philosophy, but deep respect for the ancestors who maybe in a supernatural way still able to affect what we do in this world. Other times it's simply remembering those people above us on the scale because older are preferable or more honored than younger. I'm starting to like Confucianism more and more as I become a teacher, as I become a parent, as I become older. Hey, what have I been missing all my life? China's politics called dynasties, ruling families that just move from one to the next. Father dies, son takes over. There is a sense, and this is very important for more modern China, the idea of a mandate of heaven. Now, what is a mandate? Is it what the young woman wishes to have on a Saturday night? No, it is not. A mandate is a approval of heaven. Here's the general assumption. If we have the Zhou Dynasty, and the Zhigers have ruled for 200 years, by definition, the heavens, the ancestors, not a Judeo-Christian God, capital G, one guy in heaven, but the heavens, the gods, the spiritual forces, which the Chinese generally don't worry about identifying all that clearly. Well, by the fact that the Zhou Dynasty is in power, we must have the approval of heaven. Now, if the Zhou dynasty is overthrown and the Gilwei dynasty takes over, how could that happen? Well, it's clear. The Zhou dynasty didn't behave properly, and the heavens allowed that dynasty to be overthrown. These dynasties come and go. There are 10 or 12 major ones throughout thousands of years of Chinese history, but there is a continuity for the most part. You could argue in the 20th century that's broken down a lot, but I don't think totally, and it really is Confucianism. They are all based on Confucian ideas. And even when outsiders, this happens a couple times, where non-Chinese take over all of China, rather than bring their own ideas and force it upon China, they become, as the quote is, more Chinese than the Chinese. They adopt Confucianism because it works. It works. You can take a look at this if you wish to, but you see how the dynasties happen. By the way, going back to the idea of when dynasties collapse, what starts to happen, what causes, if you look down at the aging dynasty, you start seeing all of those things that were on the list. Notice, this is not linear progression. Society starts here, it moves to here. Oh, there may be steps back, but generally it is a more or less straight line from one place to the next. That is really the Western conception of history. That's not how the Chinese see it. It is an endless cycle. And you know what? If you look at those little circles, can't you see a little yin and yang in there? Can't you? Can't you superimpose it beautifully with those arrows? That's the whole idea. We'll come back to this idea of the dynastic cycle because it's powerful in China for a long, long time. Moving on very quickly to the subcontinent of India. This is also called South Asia, and very important. If you get an essay question or other question about South Asia and you start writing about China, you blew it. Folks might know what the monsoons are. In fact, maybe take a moment from what little you might know about monsoon rains or weather patterns, etc. Stop for a moment, stop the film, and maybe describe what you are looking at here. This actually becomes very important, and it's something that I would give you a good chance will end up being on one of your AP essays. So it's something to pay good attention to. There are simply, we know now, wind and current patterns across the world, and they move in cycles. There are certain parts of the world where if you tell me where you are in the world and the month, a meteorologist could say, oh, the winds are probably coming from the south at this point to the north, and the weather is probably going to be like this. You know that wherever you live, there are rainy seasons and dry seasons, and the same is true of the winds. Turns out, you will notice that the summer monsoon winds, this is the northern hemisphere summer, so we're talking May, June, July, August, etc. Where do the winds come from and in what direction? They come from the southwest and move to the northeast. So you will see here that winds over this open ocean, by the way, tropical, hot weather, etc., the winds are moving toward India and the subcontinent. Because the weather is warm, it's going over water. It is collecting a lot. The winds are collecting clouds filled with water. And by the way, on the coast of India, here on the west coast, are fairly massive mountains. They're called Ghats, technically, Ghats, but they're mountains. And what happens is these water-filled clouds blown by the winds hit the mountains. They can't get over them, and they dump massive amounts of water. In other words, these are the monsoon rains. You will notice then what happens 6 months later. The winds are coming from the north and the east toward the south and the west. Notice that what you have up north is land, dryness. You have Mongolia, you have Western China, you have almost no water in the clouds and in the brought by the wind. So you will see almost no rain. So first of all, during the summer monsoons, you will see massive, massive storms like you've never seen, and you simply will not see rain during the winter months. That's one part of it. Another thing that's important, if you are an Indian sailor, and Indians are real pioneers in this, and you want to explore the Indian Ocean, eventually make it to Africa, when will you leave from India to Africa, to the southwest? You would leave in December because you put up your sails and you get naturally blown to Africa. And then you don't turn around, you don't unload your cargo and head back because the winds are against you. You hang out for 4 or 5 months until the winds shift, as they always do, and you can float back with your sails to India. So this is going to be a big part of the trading system that we see in what they call the Indian Ocean Basin. Also, I don't want to make too much of this, but as you know about Indian religious beliefs, or if you don't, we will very shortly, this idea of this endless cycle of birth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth. Some have argued that maybe these religious beliefs came at least partly from the weather patterns, these endless, reliable cycles of rain and dry, and rain and dry, and winds in this direction and winds reversing, that maybe Indian people took the geography, took the weather patterns sort of into their souls and spirits and gave it a religious belief. I don't think we can prove that, but that is a theory that's out there. Notice that India itself, I mean, today's India is a slightly different shape. Notice the southern part of India remained fairly independent. These empires never completely dominated all of what we call India today. By the way, you're also seeing Bangladesh and Pakistan, modern countries, as well as Nepal on here. But the borders have always come and gone. A major difference, India and China are the two dominant civilizations, honestly, all the way, I would say, at least to the 1400s. I can't think of any other civilizations as sophisticated, as dominant, as powerful, as learned, as scientifically developed as those two. Um, they also, between them, have always contained 40 to 50% of the world's population. Again, a lot of Indians out there, a lot of Chinese to be sure. One difference is that China, again, different time periods, different levels, but all a fairly unified, one major language. People identify as ethnic Chinese. This has never been as true in India. Much more disunity, much more religious diversity, ethnic diversity, much more diversity in terms of languages, etc. You don't need to know much about them, but there are, in fact, you don't need to know anything about them really, but there are two major empires that are Buddhist slash Hindu. We'll talk about this later. Tends to be actually a lot of overlap between those two, called the Mauryan and the Gupta Empire. One guy, and you'll probably see his name as you go through life, Ashoka. He was the Mauryan emperor in the 3rd century BCE, famous because he was your typical warrior type emperor, let's conquer, conquer. And then he had an experience in his life where he said, wait a minute, this is wrong, this is causing suffering. He became a devout Buddhist. And interestingly, and you can see this in India today, Ashoka said, wait a minute, my job is not to conquer, to kill, this is wrong. My job is to support life, to endorse life of all types, to live with a vegetarian diet, to tolerate other people. And Ashoka spent the last years of his life specifically promoting tolerance, openness, acceptance of other people. And in fact, these go back about 2,200 years. There are a series of old stones that are carved into them with Ashoka's messages. And the people in this area still kind of honor these. I will point out that these were some of the people of this part of India and Pakistan today, where Ashoka's monuments are some of the most handsome and beautiful people you will ever see. Oh, they are lovely, aren't they? Beautiful people. I should not have been doing this, but when I was in northwestern Pakistan and I got to this 2,500-year-old monument, nobody's paying attention to it. There are just a few kids there. I did get a picture of myself putting my hand on it, my connection with history. Technically, I shouldn't because that could be damaging as people do this more and more. I was very bad, but I did do it. The Mayans I know a little bit less about, but this is in modern day Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, etc., etc. Major civilization that honestly goes back as far as about 10,000 years ago. And then you see what they call the classic period, and that is about 300 CE to 900, etc. Remember, these big civilizations don't suddenly appear one day and then disappear on another day, but we're talking about a rise to a level of sophistication and power. And the high point is 4, 5, 600 CE. We start to see a decline around that time. And although these societies still exist, and I've spent some time in Guatemala and southern Mexico, and there are people that identify very much as Mayan. They speak Mayan languages. There is no Mayan kingdom. This is Tikal that you're looking at in northern Guatemala, the first of the great ruins I was at. Again, about 1,500 years old, and magnificent how they did this without any modern technology. It's tucked away in a jungle. you know, Confucianism has its social hierarchy. Here is the Mayan social hierarchy. Knowing that different parts of the Mayan kingdom at different points, there might, it's not always as neat as this and universal, but an idea, and you're seeing it similar. Notice, by the way, that what's missing from Confucianism is slaves. China does not have a history of slavery. This is probably not because Chinese people are nicer and more moral and they would never do that. It's largely because the Chinese population was always so massive that had labor, access to the labor was not as necessary. Yeah, again, some Mayan art, etc. You're interested in the Mayans and a little bit more about them. I have a neat little animated film. I don't know if I still have it, but used to about the Mayan holy book and the explanation of how the universe came, etc. Worth mentioning for a couple of reasons. The Phoenicians, you know what, this is modern day Lebanon primarily. This is where they were located. Notice the time period, we're talking 3,000, 3,500 years ago, the high point in the classical era. Interesting with the Phoenicians is that they were sailors. They were on the ocean. And there is a theory in history, by the way, that seaborne people tend to be more diverse and creative than land-based because they have access to civilizations far farther away. You can go much faster and farther in a ship than you can on foot or on camel or on horse, and that's the idea. One thing especially interesting about the Phoenicians, they developed, you see this above the map at the top part, the first alphabet. Up to this point, written language was largely pictures, pictographic. Chinese today, very difficult to learn because there are thousands of individual characters for the writing, and they mean what they mean, as opposed to taking letters and putting them together and spelling things like Phoenician and Mediterranean. In Chinese, you would have two entirely different pictures that represent each of these ideas, and you've memorized them. So the Phoenicians, the early sailors to be sure, and their first. Sadly, I know relatively little about the Persians. I know a lot more about modern day Iranian history. By the way, that's what Persia is. They changed their name to Iran in the 1920s or 30s, I believe. But these are massive empires. And again, we're going to spend 30 seconds on, oh, the Phoenicians. Yeah, they're these massive empires that lasted 1,300 years. Next, you will not get questions about these empires in the class. However, an important thing because Iran has become a very important country in the 20th and 21st centuries for a variety of reasons. One thing to note, the Iranians of today look back and say, we are these people. We have a history that goes back 2,500 years, and we identify with this different historical period. You don't find this with people from England, from France, from Bolivia, from the United States. That's all more recent history. The Iranians feel this. There is a unity in Iran based upon their common history. Again, look at the size of this empire. Now, you've got to realistically understand that it's not like the Iranians or the Persians control every single thing that happens in this entire empire every day for 1,300 years. You've got to know that there are areas breaking away where there is only theoretical control, all of this. But you are seeing that all the way from southeastern Europe, all the way into modern day Pakistan, close to what is India. I think this would still be Pakistan, all the way north to the borders of modern day Russia, all the way into Egypt and North Africa. At various times, this was under Persian control. Persepolis is the first Greek capital. I don't know too much more about it, except, again, very sophisticated, powerful civilization. And then we're going to look at what we call the Greco-Roman world. Greco for Greek, Roman for, I don't know, Roman? Yep, absolutely. And they are often combined. You might stop the film for a second and say, wait a minute, can I think of why this might be true? Like, why don't we say the Chino-Persian world? We say the Greco-Roman. And of course, a big part, well, the reason is that the Romans took so much from the Greeks in terms of their religion and their practices and their histories, and they very specifically invoked the Grecian world. They were different societies, different times, a lot of differences, but there's a similarity. And the Greco Roman world is pretty important from a European or a Western perspective because many of us in the West see the ancient. Sorry, I just had to interrupt. There was some noise in the background. I had to ask my daughter to shut up. Um, yeah, many in the West will say the basis of Western civilization, which today refers to Western Europe, the United States, you know what? It has its roots in the Greco Roman world. It's not a complete picture, but it is of special significance to the modern West. Thing to know about Greece is that geography makes a difference. Remember how Jared Diamond argued that a big part of history really is geographically not determined but influenced? And the same argument is made about the Greeks. First of all, the Greek peninsula. This is in a region called the Balkans because these are the Balkan mountains. They are mountainous, separated, divided. So rather than having a Greek empire, you had a bunch of independent little city states because they were fairly hard to get to one another. Also, the idea that Greece is surrounded by the sea with all these islands. Again, are seafaring people different? Are they more curious? Are they more creative? Again, to simply say, oh, geography determines everything about Greece, let's move on, would be incorrect. But to argue that geography has a real influence on societies, civilizations to this day, sure, I think that's very valid to look into. Again, you're seeing the ancient. By the way, those dolphins at the bottom. I just always loved the dolphins. Those go back to the Mycenaean civilization that I believe goes back. God, I want to say about 3,700 years. But anyway, notice, by the way, the incredible realism of these sculptures. And by the way, you don't see nude figures in Europe after the Greeks and Romans. You don't see them for at least another 1,000 years. Christianity took over. The human body is shameful. You don't reveal this. Uh, bodies are bad, bad things, and the only purpose for bodies is to create children, which will be sons of God, but otherwise, well, that's not how the Greeks looked at it. They had an idealized view. You rarely see a Greco Roman sculpture with somebody who isn't almost perfect. They saw the gods, as you probably know, as basically being special forms of humans, not all powerful gods, not press a finger and the world changes, but they have powers that humans don't have, and they are also very human. If you know any Greek mythology, you find out they get jealous, they get angry, they get irrational. A big part of the Greek worldview. Yes, pantheistic. Pan means across. Theistic means lots of different gods. The gods are very human. They're vain, they're devious, they're playful, they're mean, they get hurt, etc. What we know about Greek religion and society early, by the way, this is prior to Socrates and the Athenians that you might know about, comes from somebody who may or may not have existed, a poet named Homer who is said to have been blind and issued all of his poetry orally. Whether this is actually a person 2,800 years ago who created these, or these are stories that just came together over time and were later attributed to one person, I don't think we really know this. But Homer's ideas, the heroes, the honor, the bravery, the revenge, the pride, gods who were powerful but not all powerful, who sometimes were very, very human in their emotional responses, and the idea that at the end, it's not God who determines your life, but something called fate. And there is a scene in many Greek tragedies, Greek plays that are left, called the recognition scene, where the hero of the story suddenly looks and he sees his fate, and he recognizes that no matter what he does, this is what will happen. And this is very built into the Greek worldview. This is probably where we have the most influence today. Very few people today believe in the Greek gods, believe in Zeus and all of this, but the ideas of, well, the potentials of who should rule is fairly key. An oligarchy means very few people. The elites rule. It might be one person in a monarchy, or it might be a small number of people. And the Spartans kind of followed that. It was a military state. Then we have something called democracy. Krasi, power. Demos means the people. The idea that the people, the citizens in Athens should rule. Now, really important to understand. Everybody in Athens was not a citizen. Certainly not the younger people, the children, not women, not slaves, and they had a lot of slaves, not poor men who had no property. We are probably talking that maybe 15% of the population were considered citizens in ancient Greece at its height, maybe 10 or 15%. However, among that 10 to 15%, they enjoyed a degree of power absolutely unknown in other parts of the world because they would all attend assembly meetings. If you were a citizen, you came and you made the decisions and you voted on policy. You could be very, very randomly set up. They did this by lot. They drew straws and, oh, look, this guy, Ophidius, is this week's president or leader. So, in other words, it was a direct democracy where the people, the very elite, the small percentage, they're the ones who ruled the society. The polis is the name for the city state, the society. Hey, do you see the root of the word policy, politics, politician? That's where it comes from. So a limited definition of who is a citizen, but all citizens played an active, direct role. They didn't just vote for their leaders, they were their own leaders. By the way, worth noting down at the bottom, this is called a phalanx. This is the Athenian fighting mode in which men would line up in all ways and they would train together for years with their swords, with their shields, and they would march almost like a giant tank. If they were really in step and organized, it was almost impossible for anybody to resist that. Hence the idea, if you can afford your own shield, your own sword, you're a man, you have money, we need you to protect ourselves. That may be the origins of that democracy. Later, by the way, Athens became a seaborne power where it started to create an empire in the islands of the Mediterranean. Then, if you were a man with a strong enough back to row one of these giant ships, you could become a citizen. So citizenship requirements were actually loosened over time out of military necessity. Yeah, this is perhaps what Athens looked like in the 5th century. I was there about 30 years ago, and a lot of these ruins are still here. More sculpture. Yeah, you see the trireme ship here in the bottom left. Each one of these people was probably a free citizen because he was needed to protect the country and make the military go. Greece falls apart. We probably won't spend any time with this, but there is the high point where the Greeks defeat the Persians. There are a number of films about this. Little tiny Athens, with the help of Sparta, defeats the mighty Persian Empire. But then it also leads to a civil war, per se, or two societies, Sparta and Athens, fighting each other in the Peloponnesian War. Honestly, this pretty much destroys the democracy in Athens, because Athens is defeated. This is the golden age, though. Any names that you might know and say, "Oh, I've heard of Socrates. Oh, um, I've heard of Plato." It's all during this period. In terms of philosophy, if you hate geometry, you can blame Euclid. A guy named Democritus had this bizarre theory. He believed that although we see big forms in front of us, we see a chair, a guitar, we see a human body, it's actually made up of little teeny tiny items stuck together that can't be divided. They're so small as to be invisible. You know what? 2,500 years ago, Democritus, that was atomic theory, atoms. Now, he didn't get it all right. He believed that the atoms, once we found them, couldn't be divided. We now know we have neutrons, electrons, all of these types of things, but pretty impressive. There was also, by the way, a couple hundred years later, I can't remember the name of him, probably one of the Ptolemies, but he was a Greek philosopher who said, you know what? I know that Earth is a sphere. I know this. We all know this. The idea that everybody thought the world was flat until Christopher Columbus, that's nonsense. The Greeks knew this 2,500 years ago. What he said is, I'm going to do a series of experiments by watching the sun and shadows. And my belief is that at its center, the Earth is about, in modern language, about 23,800 miles around. You know what the real answer is? About 25,000. This was a Greek scholar with no modern technology who had never traveled more than a few hundred miles in his entire life. 2,500 years ago, he was 95% accurate about the size of the Earth. Socrates, philosopher, human beings are central, individualism. You see that in the West today. You've got to question, what is success? It's not about money. It's not about authority. It's about virtue, about knowledge, etc. Plato, who actually Socrates, we don't even know if he was a leader or writer. Plato captured his ideas. We're not going to go into the specific details with these things, but the idea these are philosophers that still we base a lot of our modern ideas upon. William McNeill, a famous sort of old-fashioned but very influential world historian, says, you know what? Think about the different worldviews of Middle Eastern peoples, Jews and Christians and Muslims with an all-powerful God. As you'll see later, those are very similar beliefs. And then the ancient Greeks, based more on logic and intellectualism and so forth. The problem of reconciling these two views in a satisfactory fashion continues to be the central intellectual problem of Western civilization. That's his analysis. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but you get an idea of these two very different influences that have created the modern West. Alexander the Great, we won't say a ton about, and I will actually opine a little bit. Often we refer to rulers as the great. What we mean is they conquered. They took over land. They made their country, their society, their empire more powerful. I think it goes without saying that this meant death and misery for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. I'm always a little bit uncomfortable looking at the so-called great military leaders and calling them the great. They probably endorse values that I don't endorse myself, and I think that we know lead to a lot of destruction. Bottom line is because the Greeks were so influential, although he was not technically from Greece, he was a little bit to the north, an area today called Macedonia, he had learned Greek. In fact, Aristotle, the philosopher, the student of Plato, was his personal tutor. Well, when Alexander takes over his territory, he leads armies out and conquers, nearly gets all the way to India. He actually dies at the age of 33, just outside of India. What's important not so much is that, this Macedonian empire becomes big, but it brings Greek culture and ideas and science to this giant region that's a part of his empire. This is called, by the way, Hellenistic, Greek-like culture. And you'll see this. This is the massive empire of Alexander. Again, in some ways, who cares? A guy raised an army and took over all this land. That was 2,300 years ago. But the fact that he was Greek in his training, knowledge, science based, took those ideas and the specific amounts of knowledge, architecture, and really made it a major influence across all this area. And so we see the influence of that still today. And then the Romans. Rome starts as a small city state in the 8th century and eventually becomes a massive empire. You see it here. It had taken over large parts of, well, modern day Turkey and parts of the modern Middle East. We know that, for example, Jerusalem, the land of Canaan, whatever we want to call it, that was all under control of the Romans. Pontius Pilate, if you've gone to your Sunday school, oh yeah, he was Roman. Exactly. All the area that you see here in colors were either directly or indirectly controlled by the Romans, so pretty massive. Um, Bottom right, a lot of you might know this story of Romulus and Remus, the two orphan boys who were actually nursed by a she wolf. So they were kept alive and they came to found Rome. Almost certainly not a real story, although really interesting because eventually one of the brothers kills the other. And boy, doesn't that sound like Cain and Abel? In Genesis in the Bible. Interesting how these religious ideas continue to spread from one faith to another. The same stories, slightly changed, etc. By the way, I will send you a copy. My very favorite musician, he calls himself the Mountain Goats, wrote a wonderful song called Up the Wolves, which is, well, takes its inspiration for the Romulus and Remus story, although it's not actually about them. So Rome becomes a republic. Republic, important word to know. Elected representatives. Now, keep in mind, not everybody voted. There were two separate governments. There were the patricians, the higher level, the wealthy. They had most of the power, but eventually there was also what they called a plebeian or a common person assembly. Now, that did not include an assembly that represented women, of course not, or slaves, or the very poor, but a substantial part of the population did have a real voice. Not direct democracy like Athens, but they got to elect their representatives. Very, very heavily borrowing from the Greeks, no question about that. Julius Caesar, who great Caesar's ghost, etc., 44 BCE, he's a real historical figure. And Rome eventually goes from a republic with votes to an actual empire. This is, by the way, a rendition of Caesar being assassinated by people that thought he gained too much power. You may have heard the phrase et tu Brutus, or if you refer to somebody as Brutus, you are a traitor, because one of his most loyal subordinates, Brutus, was a part of this assassination of Caesar. So upon Caesar's murder, a man named Octavian, a young boy actually, who later changed his name to Augustus, he takes over in 27 BCE, and this is the Roman Empire. And again, if you look at this territory here, this is a massive empire, all the way through the northern part of Germany, all the way into what we call the Middle East, North Africa, etc. There is a period in the first couple hundred years, the Common Era, that is called the Pax Romana. La Paz, the peace, the Roman peace. Now, I don't want to pretend for a second that the Romans were loving and hugging everybody. They were absolutely vicious. The crucifixions that we know about were commonly held. They wiped out whole populations. What they did do, though, is provide a sense of order. And so that's what we mean by the Roman peace. It was violent, it was vicious, it involved invading, attacking, destroying your enemies, showing no remorse. But overall, the trains ran on time, the roads were safe, that kind of thing. Trade, economic growth continued in most of these areas because of the Roman presence. Initially, of course, you have the old Greek gods. Now, with Roman names, the emperor was seen as a god, etc. One of the big conflicts with the Jews in the Holy Land is they said, no, we recognize one God. We do not recognize your Roman gods. And then when the Christian faith, which we'll be talking about in a separate thing, came about, the idea that Jesus was the Son of God here on earth, etc., that was seen as a tremendous threat to the Romans. Christians were horribly persecuted, burned at the stake and thrown to the wolves and so forth. In the year 310, though, and notice the Roman Empire starts falling apart it starts falling apart earlier, but collapses completely in the late 400s. You start seeing the Romans saying, we can see that we're getting weaker, you have an emperor in 310 saying, I am converting to Christianity. I've seen a sign, and Christianity is now legal. By 395, it is the religion, the one legal religion of Rome. Why is the Pope in Rome? Why is Rome the head of the Catholic Church? It's for this reason, because it became the state religion of Rome. Eventually, the Roman Empire becomes too big. Remember, I mentioned when empires decline, it's overextension. This is simply too far. That could be an example. What they do eventually is that the Roman emperor divides the empire into two, east and west. The west is centered in Rome. The east is centered in what was then called Constantinople. It is today known as Istanbul in modern day Turkey, and it's the head of the Byzantium or Byzantine Empire. In theory, it is one big happy empire. In reality, they start splitting apart pretty dramatically. In 476, outside invaders come, they destroy Rome, they completely depopulate it, and that is the official end of the Roman Empire. But it had been happening for a while. And again, look at our list here. Overextension, the difficulty in running an empire so massive, the expense, the military expense, the outside attackers, we mentioned that earlier. Political weakness, some emperors that were maybe more interested in hanging out and having a good time, and corruption, economic issues brought on by disease, brought on by warfare. People aren't eating, people are unhappy. Some argue that there was a moral decline. That's a little bit harder to prove, but you may have heard the name of Caligula, the emperor. I prefer that you don't look up the name because there are some very naughty stories. This is thought to be a cause of Ming China decline as well in the 14th century, that the emperors basically became party boys, and that's all they wanted to do. And notice I have a question mark, natural process of decay. There is definitely a widespread theory in history that empires are destined to rise and fall. Over time, you just can't keep the energy. Like the human life, we are born, we become stronger, we rise, and then we decay. Perhaps this is true of human civilizations as well. Very quickly, last couple things. I brought this in at almost an hour, which given that it's 1100 years, that's not so bad. Most of these won't be so long. Also worth mentioning the Bantu migrations. Bantu is a language distinction. There are many Bantu languages out in the world today. I spoke a little bit of one called Lingala when I was living in the Congo. And when I see Bantu words from other languages, I will actually recognize a lot of these words. But from about 1500 BCE, so 2500 years ago, a group of people that were localized in this area speaking a type of language began to spread out across parts of Africa. Here you see the Bantu migrations. You see them moving, and notice that this is over a 1200-year period. This doesn't happen in 15 minutes. This happens in waves and waves for well over a century. Again, where I lived in Congo, which you'll see the Congo River going through it, there were Bantu languages that were spoken there. So all of these were Bantu. The Bantus are interesting. They boast in terms of agriculture. It was largely the sweet potato, the yam. They also, by the way, developed their own iron working, their ability to make iron, to melt the ores and so forth, to make weapons and other things with this. You have, by the way, at the same time, a couple of separate kingdoms as well. By about 400 or 500, I believe, the West African kingdom of Ghana starts to develop. That lasts for many hundreds of years and has successor empires that we'll get to later. Really worth mentioning is in Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum. Ethiopia is unique among African countries. First of all, it is never colonized by Europeans during the age of imperialism in the 19th and early 20th century. The Italians attempt twice. They try to take over Ethiopia in the 1930s with Mussolini, precursor to World War II. Technically, he's able to conquer Ethiopia. It lasts about 5 years, and the Ethiopians do not accept it. Ethiopians have always maintained a very independent culture. A big part of this is because Ethiopia adopted Christianity very early on. And so there were European countries that, well, we maybe could take over Ethiopia. Ooh, but they're not pagans, they're Christians. I wonder if this is right. And this tended to protect Ethiopia. Fascinating country, though. I've been there a couple times. Love the place. Love the food. And the people, you know what? They know their history. There is a pride and sort of a head held high walk to Ethiopians where they're very, very proud of their history and their history of independence. I think that may be the last slide, so I will say goodbye right now. Remember, I'll just ask you to send in either a shot of some notes that you took, or if you're doing it electronically, just share those with me. That's fine. And again, questions. We'll talk about this stuff in class for a day or two. Are there things that you think, hey, I don't quite understand this, or I was wondering about that? So that's the idea of this. Maybe there's one more slide, but if not, this is my farewell. And there's one more slide. But I think that's it. Really, seriously, I mean it.